Hundreds of times before, Casca had been hired for his sword. It did not take a wise man to leave the mainland and look to find his sanity in the open sea. Having fought along and against the English and French during their endless conflicts, raided side by side with proud and wild Norsemen, and then seen most of them die from the Black Death, was more than enough for Casca to desire to find an escape. Perhaps returning to the sea would take him away from all of that. The dark destroyer had spread over the land, killing all that it encountered. Every time it seemed it was finally gone, only a nightmarish memory, it returned with a vengeance. Just another thing men of the cloth blamed on the Jews. If not so, then God was merely thinning out the herd of evildoers, others thought. However, that was not the case either. Hundreds who Casca had known had coughed and bled themselves to death from the hellish disease. God had little to do with it. Casca had seen men die of it everywhere his path had taken him, from the fjords of the north to the deserts in the land of Chine. The plague took all without prejudice. Distancing himself from it all, even if only briefly, was quite desirable. He had found himself on an old but apparently well-maintained merchant ship called the Kuta, the Swift One, as it was referred to. It looked broad and cumbersome, and Casca wondered how it had gotten its name, and, more important, how would it take to the sea. Casca could just see it, wallowing at the mercy of the sea under the winds of the angry Atlantic. Even with that in mind, the idea of being on board for a few weeks, going from port to port, had seemed an easy decision. Drifting on the open waters was not unlike on land, and he had no destination there either. Talem, the bearded captain of the Kuta, walked around on deck, grunting out orders. Like most captains, he seemed a man obsessed with the discipline of his crew. He yelled, spat, and sometimes even kicked at them. Ending one of their lives to make a point was not much beyond him. "A good crew should never get too comfortable," recalled Casca from voices of years past. Casca had been hired for his sword, which eliminated the need to do the filthy and exhausting grunt work that broke the strongest backs and wills. Having toiled at the oar for decades in the belly of slave ships, he likened this to a pleasure trip. He had found it unusual to see this ship relying solely on the winds and the ocean currents, not needing the efficiency and maneuverability of oars. Casca had traveled the great ocean, streaming along the rapid currents. Not much steering had been done in those sturdy balsa-wood rafts. They had allowed the ocean to guide their craft, but perhaps they'd been lucky. Once on board, Casca had found himself drowned in a mass of humanity. Most were racing on and off, carrying large leather bags and wooden boxes. He didn't care what they contained, and was not about to ask. Casca had been hired for his sword, and not to be someone to chat with. Casca was surprised to see about 36 men, armed to the teeth, loitering around the starboard bow. All they appeared to be doing was shuffling about and making the merchants nervous. The workers scurried around, trying not to make eye contact with the beastly mass. They seemed to be as diverse as the clothes they wore and the languages they spoke. Looking toward them, Casca noted how unique the group was. Nearly half of them were missing eyes, ears, noses, and probably some other unmentionable body parts. A poor excuse for henchmen, or men, for that matter. For now, it had to do. "Your sword will find itself at home, hanging by my side." The words awakened Casca from his long consideration of this motley group. Casca slowly turned to face two filthy-looking lowlifes, one more depraved-looking than the other. The two stood side by side with sword and shield in hand, looking at each